Good afternoon and welcome to this session today on Palestine and environmental justice as part of the 18th edition of the International Film Festival and Forum on Human Rights in Geneva. My name is Alaa Tartir and I'm a research associate at the Graduate Institute in Geneva and the policy and program advisor of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. It's a great pleasure to meet all of you virtually today. We had to take these measures, but we're determined to reach all of you and to tackle this issue, which is very important that we are here today, and hopefully you will enjoy this session with us that tackles environmental justice, injustice in the case of Palestine. I'm delighted here to welcome our speaker, Dr. Michael Mason. Dr. Michael is the director of the LSE Middle East Center and also an associate professor at the Department of Geography and Environment at the London School of Economics in London. It's really a great pleasure to have you here and welcome to Geneva and to the Film Festival. We apologize that our co-panelist Zina Agha was not able to be with us here. Zina wrote an excellent policy brief on the matter that can be available on the website of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, on the matter. The question of environmental justice and injustice when it comes to Palestine is also a very political question. It's not only a technical question. It's not only an environmental question. It's more a political one, especially when we think of this environmental injustice as part of the overall injustice that the Palestinians are living through over the years. So we hope over the next hour with this session and also the questions that we will receive virtually from the audience to tackle this issue and offer some food for thought and entry points that we can explore further. And maybe we start this conversation, Michael, with a general question. What does environmental justice mean? Like, what is the meaning of it and how it relates to the case of Palestine?
Okay, thank you, Alaa, and thank you to the organizers of the conference for allowing this session. I think the first thing to say is that when we talk about environmental justice or injustice for the Palestinians, is always thinking of part of a wider justice situation, a justice situation involving of course, the occupation and the siege blockade of Gaza. So we always have to remember that broader justice context. But if we go into the environmental justice, injustice part of that specifically, I think we can think about it in terms of three dimensions, as it were. The first dimension is we can think about justice in terms of participation or governance. This is the extent to which a people, a community, in this case the Palestinians, are able to have a meaningful say in their own governance. That governance may not just include environment, of course, it includes all sorts of areas. Insofar as the Palestinians are not able effectively to take control over their own self-determination, their own decisions, their own affairs, we can talk about an injustice, a governance injustice, if you like, or a procedural injustice. That's the first kind of element of injustice. The second element of injustice is we can think about injustice in terms of the distribution of environmental goods or bads. By that, I mean the extent to which the Palestinians suffer environmental harm. That can be environmental harm suffered now, or it can be also in terms of future harm. It can be the probability of harm in the future, where we use the term risk, environmental risk, and that covers all sorts of areas. So the extent to which there is injustice, we were looking at the extent to which the Palestinians are exposed to a whole series of environmental harms. These harms can include, for example, the deficits in water supply, quality of water supply, lack of access to land, lack of access to the inputs to make land productive, for example, in terms of agriculture, exposure to poor quality air. Some of the things that we ordinarily think about in terms of environmental justice in other countries also still apply to the Palestinians, but they're intensified by the particular context of the occupation Now, the third aspect of environmental injustice is what scholars call recognition or misrecognition. And here we're talking about the extent to which a community is identified as a legitimate subject in terms of politics. Here we're talking about environmental governance again. To what extent are the Palestinians recognized as having their own community, their own heritage, their own identity is valid, and are treated in dialogue with the Israelis, if that happens, as an equal, respectful partner? This takes us into areas, for example, around the culture of a community's identification with attachment to the land, the extent to which the Palestinians identify with a particular land or area of residence of the land, areas of historical kind of identification, of heritage, and so forth. And insofar, again, as this is not recognized, insofar that this is often undermined or destroyed, think about the uprooting of olive groves by Israeli settlers in the southern Hebron Hills of the West Bank. Mm-hmm. The destruction of that is, of course, an environmental bad in terms of removing a livelihood, but I thought also it's an injustice of misrecognition. And what I mean by that is you are trying to erase the cultural identity of a people from that location. So these are the kind of three aspects of injustice, and I think these are ones we have to bear in mind when we look at particular environmental issues in Palestine.
Great. So if we think of what you said as a triangle, then we see the governance, the distribution, the recognition triangle. So I hope at the end of the conversation we see, or we get to a point, what we can do in order to reverse this triangle, to have these three elements from being like challenges and threats and transform them into opportunities, especially the first one, which is the governance institutions, because I also claim and argue that this extends beyond this environmental regime, because the Palestinian people, for multiple reasons, they are not part of even of the political system, and they are not the defining features, they are not the core of it. And as we see, all of that has consequences on also on the environmental field. But if we also think about the overall picture, why does it all matter? Like how climate change, water, environment in Palestine, why do they matter? Why do they matter locally, regionally, and globally, if we think of that? So why it is relevant, why it matters at these three levels of analysis?
Yeah, I think there's sometimes a tendency to think that environmental issues are like an add-on. Mm-hmm. Once you've determined what I call the basic needs of a people, once you determine the ways in which people earn a living, the ways in which people participate politically, other ways in which people have dignified lives, then the environment is some kind of extra. And I think one thing that we have to think about is the environmental quality is at the heart of a healthy society. What I mean by that is environmental quality, meaning the conditions under which you live, your access to environmental resources, which is really important in terms of livelihoods, in terms of natural resources, and perhaps we can talk about some point about Palestinian access to natural resources in terms of the ability to have meaningful livelihoods. That all these are essential to not only to living conditions, to livelihoods, and so we have to think about the environment as a necessary kind of conditions of existence for a healthy society. And if we start off with the environment as that important bedrock, if you like, for a healthy society, that means we can't treat the environment as an add-on. Okay? It also means, I think, we go into a direction where we think about the environment not in terms of specific issues. One of the characteristics of much environmental thinking is to think of the environment as an issue, like nature conservation as an issue, climate change as an issue, water quality as an issue. Of course, we can deal with those issues, if you like, in that way, and sometimes it's important to do that in terms of trying to think about solutions. But if we step back and take a more holistic context, we can see the extent to which many of these things relate to each other. Okay, so if we think about climate change, and we think about climate change and the current potential effects of climate change for Palestinians. That will have effects in terms of, for example, changing temperatures, changing water availability, which is necessary. For example, if you think that most of the agriculture in the West Bank is rain-fed, 85% plus is rain-fed agriculture, then changing water availability from changing climate is significant. However, this is a really important proviso. We have to also make sure that we don't understand issues in the Palestine only in terms of environment. For example, I would argue that climate change is not the most important stressor on water resources in either Gaza or the West Bank. In fact, it's some way down the list. It's some way far down the list in terms of current stresses. That is more the ability of the Palestinians to access sufficient water in a context in which most of that water is extracted by the Israelis for Israeli use for Israel or for settlers in the West Bank. 80% plus of the water is extracted by the Israelis in the West Bank from the mountain aquifer. The sort of groundwater of the West Bank is taken by Israelis, used by Israelis for Israelis. So we have to think about it in terms of that broader context and try to think or determine the extent to which environmental issues are linked to these broader political economic issues. Not to say that there's not a merit from asking environmental science or experts in water or experts in climate change, for example, to help us understand the situation facing the Palestinians. But I think the key lesson here is to acknowledge the exceptional, the deeply exceptional circumstance of the Palestinians, and not to think that understanding how to deal with environmental issues for the Palestinians is simply transplanting, if you like, methods and solutions you would use in the UK or Germany, and pretend, for example, the occupation doesn't exist, pretend the conflict is not there, because it does nobody any favors, doesn't do the Palestinians any favors, and it often misdiagnoses the causes of what seem to be environmental problems.
And if we take this holistic context into account, then we're talking mainly how the Palestinians live under process of colonization, under systems of discrimination and apartheid, and under brutal military occupation over the years. So how does how is climate change, how does it relate to the context of occupation, apartheid, and colonization that the Palestinians live under? So, and that goes back to your holistic context.
We can go to if we start off just talking about climate change in terms of climate change, of course, there are projections for the Eastern Mediterranean. Depends on what happens in the rest of the world in terms of climate mitigation efforts of other countries, of course. And we have to remember the Palestinians, quite admirably, actually are, as members of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, express commitments to reducing their own emissions. Climate change emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, even though the Palestinian per capita CO2 kind of emissions are only a tenth of the global average. Okay, so it's not their responsibility in a way, and other countries, industrialized countries, should be acting first anyway. Okay, so the Palestinians have a climate change strategy. The Palestinians are part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It took them a couple of years to get there. 2016, they finally got there after opposition from the Americans and the Israelis to them joining the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That means they are respected now as equal parties, at least in terms of the international climate change community based around the UN system. Yeah. So climate change, there are forecasts for climate change, for example, about increase in temperatures. So by mid-century, we're talking about increase by 1.5 degrees centigrade, 2.5 kind of range compared to pre-industrial mean average temperature globally. That's significant. We're talking about reduction in rainfall. Again, there's a variation depending on the forecast, 20, 30% reduction in precipitation. And we're talking sometimes not acknowledged that sea level rise is significant. Sea level rise, particularly in terms of Gaza. And the uncertainty here is probably even more than with precipitation or temperature rise, where, again, estimates by end of the century, 1.1 of a meter to 0.4, 0.5 of a meter sea level rise. Now, that's significant. That's significant not just in terms of loss of some coastal land, mainly in terms of Gaza, in terms of increasing saline intrusion, increasing salt water coming into the groundwater aquifer, the so-called coastal aquifer underneath Gaza. Already, the coastal aquifer is not drinkable. 97% of the water coming from the coastal aquifer underneath.
As many UN reports testify.
As many international organizations reported. This is going to make that quality situation even worse. Now, these are the projections. The climate change, the Palestinians, several years ago, I was involved with the UNDP, helping the Palestinian Authority formulate a climate change adaptation strategy. Because when we think about climate change impacts, the first thing to say is the Palestinians' mitigation is not the challenge, it's adaptation. Okay, and how will we adapt to present and future climate change impacts? I think these are significant. We can't dismiss these. These are not as significant as occupation-related restrictions on natural resources, on water. But it does no harm, I think, to work through and assess what these impacts might be. Now, given, as I said earlier, like if the Palestinians are very, very dependent on rain-fed agriculture, then other things being equal, a reduction in water availability affects your viability of rain-fed agriculture. Increased temperature events. Think about increased kind of warming. And by that, we don't just mean a simple increase in temperature. We're also thinking about or projecting increased high temperature events, extreme precipitation events, less rainfall, but extreme floods. In the past, Gaza in particular has suffered from extreme flooding. We can expect more of that. At least that's a projection. So all these things, when the UNDP about 10 years ago first looked at this in terms of climate change impacts, the key sectors in terms of vulnerability were agriculture. Agriculture, which is a significant economic sector for the Palestinians, and in terms of water availability, and the indirect impacts on water quality. So again, as I say, these are significant impacts which will become more significant over time. But as I said initially, let's step outside the context. Let's not think about this a divorce from the geopolitical context of occupation of the Gaza blockade siege, because those things are far, far more important in terms of, for example, restricting Palestinian access to water resources, restricting Palestinian access to land. Think about, for example, agriculture in Gaza. 20% of the agricultural land in Gaza is off limits because it's in the so-called Israeli border zone. So that's much, much more important than any climate change impact at the moment in terms of access to agricultural land in Gaza.
Absolutely, and if we think of agriculture, it used to be the backbone of the Palestinian society and the Palestinian economy. It was totally damaged, primarily because of the continuation of the Israeli occupation. But with your reflection, I actually have two follow-up questions. One on the significance of these international treaties, international instruments. If we think about these international tools that the Palestinians have, like joining the international treaties, one, how do they enhance the lives of the Palestinians, like the everyday lives? And second, how they can be tools to hold Israel as occupying power accountable? Is there a significance?
That's a very good question, because on the face of it, you would think that international environmental treaties in which Palestine is a member as an equal party would mean the treatment of Palestine with the same equality of respect as other sovereign states in these treaty systems. And at least on the surface, that's the case. Within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Palestine is an equal partner. The importance of Palestine becoming a partner, a party of the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change, is that they are then able to access funding, for example, for climate change adaptation. Now, up to this point in time, they haven't had the funding necessary to achieve the kind of adaptation efforts that they want to achieve in Palestine. It's important to note that the adaptation planning by the Palestinian Authority in terms of climate change, even if climate change were not to happen as projected, would have many additional benefits for the Palestinians. For example, their proposals in terms of the Palestinian adaptation plan around precision agriculture, around water efficiency, for example, around coastal defenses in Gaza, which will have benefits regardless of any climate stress. According to the Palestinian Authority, they need $3.5 billion to fund the minimum platform of measures necessary to reduce the greatest vulnerability of Palestinians to climate change. Funding to that point is nowhere near that. But at least being in the treaty system, the climate change treaty system, they have the possibility of trying to not only access some of that money, but also to get assistance, expertise from other parties to the treaty. Now, that's at least the optimistic part in the sense that they're acknowledged as a party in this treaty. The more difficult challenge becomes, again, this goes back to the idea of thinking that the governance context in Palestine is no different from any other country. But the West Bank is occupied, Gaza's under blockade siege.
And occupied, yeah.
Yeah, and occupied. And so in both cases, Palestinians have no effective control over their economies, over their political systems. Now, in these situations, international environmental law is not the paramount law. The paramount law in these situations is international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law does have some, not very many, environmental provisions. Often these are indirect, okay? These provisions, for example, if we look at the Hague Conventions, the Hague Regulations, 1907, they include an Article 55, which requires the occupying power not to use the resources, the natural resources of an occupied territory in a way which depletes the capital of those resources, and only to use those resources, if they have to, in a way which can be militarily justified. It does not justify anything around settler colonization, for example. Okay? One of the problems which international legal scholars face is how you square up the obligations under international environmental law with international humanitarian law. This is not dissimilar from scholars and practitioners trying to figure out, for example, to what extent does international human rights law apply in Palestine? And how does international human rights law equate or overlap or clash sometimes perhaps with international humanitarian law? So what that means is when we go into international humanitarian law, the overriding obligation on the occupying power is not to transform the territory in which they're occupying. It's not to take resources out. It's not to put settlers in. It's to respect the population in the occupied territory. It's to respect the property rights within the occupied territory, both private property rights and public property rights. And so if we look through the lens of international humanitarian law, and of course, for example, we know Israel does not acknowledge that international humanitarian law, say, Fourth Geneva Convention, is applicable in the occupied territory, although in practice, in its legal system, it's kind of recognized some of the norms of that law as being applicable. That if we start off with that lens, then we see the environmental issues for a very different kind of understanding, which is that the responsibility moves from the Palestinians to the Israelis. And that's very important because the international environmental treaties put the environmental responsibility on the state, on the party signing up to and becoming a party of an international environmental treaty. If we do not acknowledge the international humanitarian law context of the Palestinians, then we can slip into the fallacy of thinking that the Palestinians are responsible for their environmental futures, their environmental present, environmental future. Well, at the moment, of course, in terms of their overriding effective control over Palestine, the Israelis are the ones with the responsibility, the overriding responsibility and obligation to respect and address environmental challenges facing the Palestinians, not just environmental, of course, social, political, economic. And that, again, going back to that context of, and here the international community has to wake up, if I may say, because the international community is quite welcoming to the Palestinians. Please come and join us in the climate change treaty, be an equal party, but at the same time does not acknowledge, again, the exceptional governance context of the Palestinians and why they cannot act.
I will come to the question of international community in a second and what should be the responsibility and what are the tools that they have to. But this is a quick reminder to our audience that we're happy to receive your questions. So please join the conversation with your questions. And I want to follow up, Michael, with the question of natural resources that you raised. And if we zoom in onto the water in particular. So what are the challenges to the Palestinian over access to water? We know very well, if you look at many infographics out there or reports published by the UN or other international body or even local, so you see like a clear structural inequality between Palestinians and Israeli settlers, let's say here in the example of the West Bank, about access to water, quality of water, and here I'm not mentioning Gaza, so if we want to focus on Gaza, that's another follow-up question, but I would like to understand better these challenges that the Palestinians are facing, especially on access to water, because it's linked to agriculture, it's linked to the quality of life, it's linked to a very basic right that we all should have without any question. So,
I think perhaps as a beginning to an answer to that question, if I may, let's just sort of set out what the asymmetry is. So World Health Organization, for example, says that the minimal kind of water consumption level is 100 liters per capita per day.
Yeah.
Again, there are different statistics here and different data, and there's some variation. But if we look at the international reports, we're seeing that in the West Bank, the average between 70 and 80 liters per capita per day, below the World Health Organization minimum. In Gaza, it's actually more. It's up to 90, 95, but we have to remember there in Gaza, it's not usable water until it's treated, yeah? And so what's the Israeli consumption? Israelis claim they're consuming no more than the Palestinians, but if you look at the settler consumption in the West Bank, 5-6 times as much as Palestinians. Some commentators say it's up to 700 liters per capita per day for some Israel settler use in the Jordan Valley. So I don't think anybody can doubt that there's a major asymmetry there in terms of use of water. That's our starting point. Why is this the case? Why can't the Palestinians access more water? Well, because they're in a situation where the control of their water resources is Israelis. Okay, there's supposed to be, there's something called the Oslo Accord, the second Oslo Accord, which has provisions for water provision between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It gives Israelis 80% of the water, West Bank aquifer water. It gives Palestinians 20%. However, what it doesn't say is that Israel controls all that water. So it's up to Israel to determine to what extent the Palestinians have access to that water. Now, why can the Palestinians not access more water? The Oslo II Accord creates a mechanism called the Joint Water Committee, which is supposedly a joint Israeli-Palestinian institution which receives applications to drill for wells, for example, to invest in water infrastructure. The Joint Water Committee, JWC, has overwhelmingly denied Palestinian applications for water infrastructure investment in the West Bank. Okay, Israelis said, well, no, look, we agree, we've agreed to this, we've agreed to that. So you have to look in more detail at the JWC. There's a scholar, Jan Selby, University of Sussex, who's done important research on the JWC. In a situation at the moment where the Israelis will say, well, the Palestinians have all these wells, they don't need, or if they do need, it's not much. We're dealing with a situation where the water table is going down. The water table is going down because the Israelis have deep wells. So many of the existing Palestinian wells are losing their water. The Israelis are not allowing the Palestinians to drill deep. Okay, many of the key extraction by the Israelis is in the so-called Western aquifer, part of the mountain aquifer, where Israel has 300 plus deep wells. This is extracting water at a rate faster than or above the natural recharge rate of the aquifer. So let's go back to the Hague regulations. This is extracting the water in a way which breaches the Hague regulation that the occupier is obliged to respect what's called usufruct in the technical term, but basically to use the resources in a sustainable way, but only for its own military needs. Here we're talking about civilian needs and settler needs, okay? So there's an IHR, International Humanitarian Law, context to this. So what can the Palestinians do? They can't access the Jordan River, okay? They have to buy water. They have to buy water from Israel. Israel says, well, look, Israel now, 80% of Israeli water is desalinated water. Israel no longer has any technical challenge to its own water supply. Some people say Israel is producing too much water, yeah? So Israel is producing its own water, so-called new water, with a series of desalination plants on the coast. Israel says, okay, it's fine, we will sell the Palestinians water. Yeah, we will also sell water to the Palestinians we're extracting in the West Bank. Understandably, Palestinians say, why would we buy our own water? Why would I buy water that I own, which you've stolen from me, now you want to sell back to me? So I do not recognize this market transaction. But they have to, they're forced to, because they're in a situation in which they need to have the water. Okay, so there's an issue. Donors face this problem all the time in terms of investment in water infrastructure, because what often happens is donors come in, often with the best of intentions to, for example, and I've seen this myself in the West Bank, where they invest in a water system, some kind of water tank or reservoir, which is then destroyed by the Israeli military, because the permit is not there. Some donors, we get into a surreal situation of donors are going in and building something, being destroyed, they're going back, building it again. And it's madness. It's madness in terms of a lack of rationality and justice to a situation. Is all you're trying to do is ensure enough water to the population in this area, the Palestinian population, to ensure that they meet their basic needs, are able to also maybe use some more water for agriculture, maybe develop some irrigation and so forth. So the big issue there is lack of access to water, particularly quantity of water. In Gaza, the Gazans have access to water overwhelmingly from the groundwater aquifer. As I said, most of the great majority of this water is not usable. Okay, so they have to desalinate the water through lots and lots of small-scale reverse osmosis desalination. Some donors are coming in. The European Union has recently upgraded the southern Gaza desalination plant to eventually serve up to, I think, 250,000 people in Khan Yunis and Rafah area. So there is investment there, but there the issue is about maintenance and training, also maintenance of the water infrastructure, because often the maintenance is neglected because Israel won't allow in the necessary parts to maintain the water treatment plants and desalination plants, because these are treated as so-called dual use. Meaning Israelis say, okay, these components, if they come in, might be used in a way which is hostile to us. So we will not allow them in. This means the water infrastructure is neglected. Okay, so the big challenge in Gaza is quality of water. There's also issues, in terms of access. To enough water, but it's quality. There is for example, there is a potential time bomb in Gaza in terms of the emergence of so-called superbugs from the fact that lots of water, untreated wastewater is being discharged into large pools. There's a large, I remember when I was doing the work in Gaza, this large kind of waste pool just adjacent to Khan Yunis refugee camp. These are cesspits of infection, of contamination, discharge of wastewater into the sea. And there are the emergence now of these sort of antibiotic resistant bugs. This is relevant at the moment, of course, with coronavirus, which is a potential time bomb. And I would argue, if anything, the Israelis, it's in your self-interest. Even if you do not want to deal with the Palestinians in a way which respects them as an equal partner, even if that's not the case at the moment, hopefully sometime in the future there might be a political elite that does do that. But say at the moment there's not, of course, even if you want to treat the Palestinians, even if you won't treat the Palestinians with respect, in your own self-interest, in your own self-interest, you must ensure that the water treatment in Gaza produces water which enables people to live and be healthy. Some of the Hadira desalination plant in Israel sometimes has to, Ashkelon as well, sometimes have to shut down because of the infusion of wastewater from Gaza. So there's a massive ecological irrationality happening.
Absolutely, and here you're raising a very important question about the role of external intervention and the role of the donor community. Donor community invested billions of dollars since the start of the peace accords, so-called peace accords, and until now they keep repeating the same mistakes. This is why we see the effectiveness of this international aid always on stake and always problematic. The natural resources, the water, is an issue, but also that is because of the lack of accountability mechanisms. When they invest in building like water infrastructure projects, and as soon as they finish them, Israel as occupying power go and destroy them, then what is the pushback from the international community? In many occasions, they ask the Israeli government to send them a report about all these damages, but then they redo the investment again and again without holding Israel, the actor that did the harm here, accountable. And that's a question that, it's like goes beyond the environmental question.
But remember, under international humanitarian law, the occupying power has the responsibility to enable those humanitarian actors to come in and discharge their responsibilities.
Absolutely, but what they are doing is that they're adding another level of pressure and another level of control on them. But I would like to go back to an earlier point that you raised on the Joint Water Committee, because this is a derivative, it's a product of the Oslo Accords that started like in the early 90s. And this urges me to ask, to what extent like the different kind of peace arrangements or so-called peace arrangements or negotiations paid attention to these questions of climate change, natural resources, and environmental issues. Like, were there any central in these issues? I mean, I don't want to think of the recent so-called Israeli-American deal of century, but is there like an attention to that area in these peace negotiations?
Well, firstly, if we might very, very briefly say something about the deal of the century, and here I might invite our audience to look at a opinion piece by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times last month, where he looks at the so-called Trump peace plan from the perspective of the environment. And it's titled something like "How Mother Nature Scoffs at the Trump peace plan." And it's all about the extent to which the plan fragments the territory, fragments the kind of responsibility over resources, doesn't give the Palestinians significant sovereign authority to be able to control their environmental resources, and completely ignores these overarching environmental issues, and completely ignores the sense in which you have to understand the environmental problems here in a kind of transboundary regional context. So that's just to note yet another reason.
Very important.
Yet another reason why this so-called peace plan is deeply flawed, and that's putting it mildly. Yeah, to go to the negotiations, the final status negotiations. These are not active, have not been active for some time, but there is a water file. There is a water file within the sort of so-called final status negotiations. These are the things that the Oslo Accord was supposed to buy time for, to then get back into action. This hasn't happened, yeah? But the final status negotiation, the water file, lots of interesting work done by the PLO, Negotiation Support Unit, to try to find a water solution compatible with these Israeli kind of interests, I would argue. And the proposal they put out was that the production of new water by the Israelis gives the Israelis scope now to respect and recognize equal per capita water use, at least in the West Bank, and more importantly, to recognize Palestinian water rights in the West Bank, and Gaza, of course, and this was unresolved. Oslo Accord said this would be dealt with, of course. So the Palestinian negotiating position is that what we want, you will not be penalized if you're Israel. You're producing lots and lots of new water. All we're asking for is access to the water beneath us in the mountain aquifer. Yeah, you can even have some of that if you want. We will come to an agreement. Yeah, but it's our water. We must respect in terms of they argued international water law, which has its own kind of principles of equitable and reasonable use. Yeah, so you have to recognise international water law norms apply. Now, interestingly, this is where the climate change area comes in, because although there's no file within the final status negotiations which deals with climate as such, in the discussions, in the technical discussions around water within the final status negotiations, the Israelis said to the Palestinians, "Well, we of course we're producing more water, but we can't recognize your water rights in the West Bank. We can't give you more water, at least not as much as you want. We'll say it to you. We can't give you more water. We can't give you authority over your water resources." And one of the reasons they cited was climate change, because there will be less fresh water available. This is a spurious reason, of course, because there's plenty of new water there. So it directs us to the heart of the issue. The heart of the issue is the control authority, sovereign authority over water resources in the West Bank is necessary for Palestinian statehood. And at the moment, the Israelis are not willing to recognize Palestinian sovereignty over natural resources. Again, going back, international humanitarian law states that the occupied population in a territory retains sovereignty over its natural resources, and that the occupying power should not remove or deplete those natural resources. So that was the position from which the Palestinian negotiating team were coming from. And it's unfortunate because I think unlike perhaps refugees, Jerusalem file, very difficult as well, at least with the water file, I think there's actually a solution there, a technical, it's a solution, of course there's a technical aspect, but also a political solution which means that water, the supply of water is not the obstacle to resolving that file. The supply of water is not the problem. It's the perception of water.
Absolutely.
The perception of water as a sovereign resource.
Absolutely, and here you refer to the international law, but also what can be done. So my question, what can the international community do in all of this? Like you mentioned lots of examples of how this environmental injustice is testified on the ground and is manifested in so many ways at multiple levels. So what are the tools that the international community can deploy there or can use to address this injustice?
I mean, it won't surprise you if I say, and everybody acknowledges this, even people who work in governments responsible for the sort of Israel-Palestine issue, there's a systemic organized hypocrisy in the international community, where on the face of it, they say, yes, we want a solution, we want a two-state solution, two peoples to live in peace, in respectful coexistence. Who would not want that? Yet at the same time, their actions are undermining that. Their actions are undermining that goal. And that is, I think, a betrayal, not only to the Palestinians, I think it's a betrayal to the Israelis, because the Israelis want peace as well. We want all people in the area to have peace and to live in this respectful coexistence. So the international community, I think, because they're not prepared to expend their political capital to upset Israel, even though there are many parties, there's a large section of Israeli civil society that would want the international community to engage with the Israeli government in a way which is respectful but also robust, to say, surely you can recognize it's in your self-interest that we have some kind of long-term, sustainable, peaceful solution here. So I mean, the example we were just discussing about donors in the West Bank investing in water projects, which are then demolished, and they go back and they construct another water system. It's demolished again by the Israeli military. To use a technical term, it's extraordinary extent to which the donor community is pissing away great amounts of finance, resources, and not even learning the lessons. And again, it's doing nobody any good. It leads to increased disenfranchisement and disenchantment by the Palestinians, because they can't organize their lives in any meaningful way. They can't organize their livelihoods, their agriculture. They have continuing mobility restrictions. And so the international community has to, at some point, take the responsibility to really, really engage seriously with this. Mm-hmm. It doesn't help that the international community often is very willing. I think it's not a bad thing, for example, that the international community, of course, will want to engage with Israel, like the European Union. We'll have a trade agreement with Israel. Fine, let's have trade. Let's integrate, economic sort of transactions if we can involve the Palestinians. But at the same time, not seem to accept that you can't simply have a, quote, normal trade agreement as if the conflict does not exist. Mm-hmm. And we go back to the same issue over and over again. The international community wants to pretend in some way that the conflict doesn't exist. Yeah? Of course, the international community wants to deal with Israel as a partner, to try to persuade the Israeli government to engage in a peaceful, respectful resolution of the problem. But at the same time, the international community is very scared of challenging Israel for whatever reason. In some cases, say the US, but it's because they're important political constituencies which do not allow you to go into that territory, as it were, to challenge Israel. Europeans are more divided, again, but the lack of a concerted effort, and it means that nobody's benefiting. And in some ways, some commentators and scholars argue that it actually makes the situation worse.
Of course.
And the donors are basically paying for the occupation. And it would be better for the Palestinians if the donors withdrew. It would be better for Palestinians if the PA dissolved. And you just had an honest occupation and showed how things really are.
One of the main principles of international aid intervention is not to do harm.
Yes.
And it is very clear now, with lots of evidence from over the last decades, that the international community is doing harm. And here, if we're talking more about the so-called development aid, but the international community is refusing to learn the lessons. Maybe they acknowledge it behind the closed doors, but when it comes to the real implementation of projects, they keep repeating the same mistakes, and they are unwilling to change and refusing to learn. So they are doing harm, and also by not holding Israel as an accounting power, as an occupying power accountable, they contribute to this process of vicious cycle that is going on. But here I also want to ask a question more regionally, let's say, because in your research you work on the occupied Golan Heights as well as in northern Cyprus, and so maybe if you think about, if you use like a regional lens, what kind of lessons can we learn for the future from,
I think the unfortunate start to my answer is that with northern Cyprus and the occupied Golan Heights, we have a situation in which the occupation, as it were, has intensified. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And we've gone in a situation in terms of international humanitarian law where the international optimal solution is not there in terms of a peaceful negotiation about the future of the Golan Heights, peaceful negotiation between parties about the future of northern Cyprus. In both cases, you have a settler colonization taking place, both in the Golan Heights and in northern Cyprus, with Turks moving into northern Cyprus. In both cases, you have I've done some recent research which I've kind of labelled under the rubric of hydraulic patronage. What I mean by that is the extent to which the occupying power is enabling the settler colonization in terms of provision of water. So, for example, with northern Cyprus, the Turkish government pumps water, fresh water, from southern Turkey through a pipe under the surface of the sea to northern Cyprus, 75 million cubic meters a year, to try to water resource an occupation. Mm-hmm. In the same way with the occupied Golan Heights, Israel then also, we have the issue also about extracting water resources, which the indigenous Arab population says is our resources anyway, but also subsidizes water resource extraction, invests water infrastructure, which favors a particular group, the own kind of Israeli settler group. So in both cases, unfortunately, we're also characterized by this injustice. So maybe in terms of, to try to turn the question into a positive answer, mm-hmm. if we can start to compare these sorts of situations and say, okay, if the dynamics of the situation, environmental dynamics and other dynamics, socioeconomic, political, are intensifying injustice, how do we go in the reverse direction? What would it mean? What would it mean to have less asymmetry? What would it mean to have more governance participation by the indigenous populations? Mm-hmm. What would it mean to recognize the indigenous population's own kind of heritage, own kind of land use, own attachment to the land? So we have to start off, I think, by a kind of critique, and by working in reverse, as it were. How do we? I think often it's much, much easier to think about reversing injustice than applying justice.
This is a very important reminder, and these are really valid but very important questions that we need to address as international community. But here, I also received so many questions from the audience.
Lots of questions.
So thank you so much. It's a difficult task because we don't have lots of time, but we have many excellent questions. So let's start with this question. We know that there is a correlation between the environment and health. What will happen if the coronavirus arrives in the Gaza Strip?
As we might, I mean, I do not know the situation as we talk here at the mm-hmm. moment in terms of coronavirus in Gaza and the West Bank. But if we say it would be arriving in a situation in which the population is already unable to be robust in terms of response to the virus. I mean, one thing we can say about the population in Gaza is very, very young, and the coronavirus seems to be more harmful, at least as far as we know at the moment, in terms of elderly people. However, then we have the situation of we have lots and lots of vulnerable young people in Gaza, and the proximity of everybody. It's a very, very high density situation in which the healthcare infrastructure is minimal at best in terms of existing problems around, as I said earlier, around water supply. It's an explosive situation. Mm-hmm. And again, it's an explosive situation where it's not in the interest of the Israelis purely out of self-interest to let Gazans suffer a major outbreak of the coronavirus without allowing a major international assistance or themselves assisting in some way.
As a potential power again.
Yes.
And I'm trying to move as fast as possible with this question. Another question, how can the Palestinians decide for their own climate policy when they depend on international donors, knowing that these donors have their own political agenda? We hinted to this, but the question is basically, if I want to paraphrase that, how they can own this process of climate policy and be in the driver's seat.
Well, if you look at, they have a national adaptation strategy. The most recent version is 2016. Mm-hmm. In the strategy, they put forward a series of options of what they want to do in terms of climate adaptation, which don't just adapt to climate stresses, but also generate other benefits at the same time. As I said earlier, in terms of, for example, increased water efficiency, more productive agriculture, and so forth. So they've already recognized this, and in their adaptation strategy, 2016, they said, we want to do these things, but these things are conditional on finance, conditional support for the international community. So in a way, they have to find their own agenda. The international community has to meet that, has to rise to that challenge of funding those adaptation activities. Of course, they've shaped those activities in a way which meets the perception that these are climate change measures. So in that way, they've had to frame their actions in terms of potential reaction to climate change as climate change measures, where, again, if we step back, we have to understand these are measures within an exceptional governance context under occupation. But of course, they haven't been able to say that in those terms in their strategy. But I think it's very clear, if you look at the strategy, that these things would be of benefit, but within the constraints of the occupational context.
Another question, and here I'm also rephrasing it, on the new Trump plan. How can you challenge it using environmental arguments? What would be your top environmental arguments to challenge that plan? I mean, you also hinted to that, but if you can recap on that.
This is the Jerusalem tram you're talking about?
The so-called deal of century.
Oh, sorry, the Trump plan. So it's a tram, sorry. Yeah. What are the environmental arguments?
Yeah, what kind of arguments coming from environmental domain that you can
yeah, I mean, as I said,
plan
have a look at Thomas Friedman's. I mean, you can't say that that's somebody who's a radical. Yeah, look at Thomas Friedman's op-ed in New York Times last month, which says, titled Mother Nature Scoffs at Trump Middle East Peace Plan. And it's basically that the environmental arguments are, it doesn't apply an environmental lens even to the situation. And insofar it thinks about resources and control of resources, it deals with them in a very kind of separatist manner. Israelis would do this, the Palestinians would do this. So it does not recognize interdependencies. It does not recognize the extent to which water flows across borders. It does not recognize the extent to which air pollution flows across borders. It does not recognize the extent to which a meaningful Palestinian state will have to have meaningful economic interaction with Israel. The challenge, I think, I mean, I'm not even in a situation where I would say it's worthwhile even engaging with that plan, yeah, because it is so deficient on so many levels that, again, perhaps we should start from a different starting place.
And then, very briefly, another question: what can the Palestinian Authority do at this moment, not related to Trump plan, but overall related to the environmental challenges in Palestine now, being under occupation? What would be their policy, top policy interventions or decisions that they need to do to tackle these challenges?
I think if you're dealing with the immediate kind of situation in both the West Bank and Gaza, and the extent to which Palestinian Authority has influence in Gaza, it has to be around water, has to be around enabling increased investment in water infrastructure, to increase quantity of water, increase quality of water, and think about designing water infrastructure both in the West Bank and Gaza in a way that becomes more resilient. What I mean by that is able to suffer shocks, whether they're externally in terms of Israeli actions or internally in terms of a lack of maintenance of a particular facility. So you have to think, I think, in terms of a much more decentralized network of provision of supply of water. One of the problems with donors is donors love going in with big capital investments because it makes them look good in their home country, and they can photograph their minister in front of a nice glossy desalination plant. But it's the wrong direction. Start off, think of small scale, decentralized, resilient infrastructure.
We only have 1 minute to go, but I don't want to finish this conversation without reflecting some positive news, and just on a positive note. So, trying to end this conversation on a positive note, what are the positive signs that you see out there that Palestinians and justice seekers can capitalize on and build on to truly achieve environmental justice?
I think here briefly, we can take inspiration, and inspiration has been taken from the rest of the world in terms, I know this sounds like a cliche, but it's true, it's just young people. young people, bottom-up justice activism. We see lots of young people, Israelis, Palestinians, prepared to work together to try to pressure their governments to introduce measures to raise awareness around the environment, and to have dialogue with each other, to act as an example, often an inspiration to their elders as to the way to go forward, because the elders have failed them. Yeah, and so it's up to them to kind of address the issue. And it's from the young people, I think, that we get the imagination and the motivation, the commitment, and the emotional, mental resource to face the challenges in the future.
Indeed, the young generation, the new generation have the responsibility to design new vision for the future and pursue that future. I do have more questions, but I'm afraid we ran out of time. This conversation can be continued in so many other ways, but I really would like to thank you very much, Michael, for being with us today, and thank you all for all the excellent questions that you sent us today, and it was a pleasure to be with all of you and to host you, Michael, here. Thank you very much,
Thank you very much, and thank you for those questions as well.
Pleasure.